Just as faith and pure insight belong in common to the element of pure consciousness, so also are they in common the return from the actual world of culture. Consequently, they present themselves according to three aspects. First, each is an intrinsic being on its own account, apart from all relationships. Second, each stands in relationship with the actual world in an antithesis to pure consciousness. And third, each is related within pure consciousness to the other. Here in this very short paragraph, number 530, Hegel is setting out for us a tripartite movement, or rather tripartite mode of analysis that he's going to carry out in the next several paragraphs to come, all of which are quite short until we get to the end of this section, which by itself is not particularly long, faith and pure insight. We started out with two fairly long paragraphs, and then we had this marathon in 529, and now Hegel is going to bring this to kind of a close and begin again. So he says, just as faith and pure insight belong in common to the element of pure consciousness. We saw this in 429. They are both connected to each other, as Hegel mentioned just a little bit earlier. Faith is pure consciousness of essence, and therefore it is thought, but it has content, but not self-consciousness, whereas insight has self-consciousness, but not content. Hegel now is interested in how do we, in fact, bring these together, and how do we move from faith into the pure insight that is going to lead us, by the end of this, to the historical movement of the Enlightenment. So he says, just as faith and pure insight belong in common to the element of pure consciousness, so also are they in common the return from the actual world of culture. And here we have a very important theme that's starting to be elaborated. So why did we arrive here in the first place? The actual world of culture turned out to be kind of a bust. We saw first this struggle with self-consciousness, trying to figure out where it fit in as noble in relation to state power, and then wealth, and its opposite, the ignoble consciousness, a lot of back and forth with that. And we eventually wound up with culture as being this place of alienation that language made possible. And we saw that there was an attempt on the part of some sort of, naive or we might say good thinking consciousness to recuperate that, and it just totally failed. So now we have this jump into the supersensible beyond, which is in consciousness, pure consciousness, and it is thought. So Hegel says, first, faith and pure insight are going to present themselves under the aspect of what's being translated here as intrinsic being on its own account, which is really an und für sich sein, being in and for itself. So what is its being as such? What is the being of faith? What is the being of pure insight? Apart from any sort of relationship or connection to anything else, what are they in and for themselves? Now, to ask what they are for themselves takes us beyond merely the in itself, because remember, für sich sein has a certain reflexivity to it. So that's going to be quite important. So that's going to happen in the next paragraph. Then Hegel is also going to talk about the relationship of both of these, pure insight and faith, to the actual world. What is this actual world? The actual world of culture, the actual world of alienation, the actual world of these spiritual powers of wealth, state power, and moving beyond them, right? So he says, each stands in relationship with the actual world. The actual world is being placed in an antithesis with pure consciousness. But pure insight and faith are, in fact, pure consciousness. Then there's a third factor as well. Each of them exists in a relation to the other as its other. So pure insight has faith as its other. Faith has pure insight as its other. Notice what they don't have as their other, the actual world. As a matter of fact, you might say that at this point in time, both of them have surpassed the actual world, and they're battling out amongst each other in terms of which one is going to dominate pure consciousness. And the answer, of course, is it's going to be pure insight, but we have to see how we get there. So Hegel is going to bring this to a close by saying each is related within pure consciousness to the other, to its other. And notice that we really have three different terms here. We have faith, we have pure insight, and then we have the actual world. And what's going to happen in the paragraphs to come is going to play off of each of those. In the consciousness of the believer, the aspect of being in and for itself is its absolute object, whose content and determination we already know. For according to the notion of faith, it is nothing else but the actual world raised into the universality of pure consciousness. The articulation of this world, therefore, constitutes the organization of the world of faith, except that, in the latter, the parts do not alienate themselves in their spiritualization, but are beings, each with an existence of its own. Spirits which have returned into themselves and abide with themselves. The moment of their transition into one another is therefore only for us an alienation of the specific character in which they exist in their distinctiveness, and is only for us a necessary series for faith. However, their difference is a tranquil diversity, and their movement a real happening. Here in paragraph 531, Hegel is now going to explore that first aspect, at least in relation to faith. That is, it's in and for itself being, it's an und für sich sein, right? And he says, in the consciousness of the believer, the person who is engaged in believing, the aspect of being in and for itself is its absolute object, whose content and determination we already know. Now, why do we, in fact, already know its content and determination? This is something worth actually lingering over. Does Hegel mean that as the phenomenologist looking over history, this is closer to us in time, say, than the master-slave dialectic or some of the other dialectics that we've seen, and so we're very familiar with this, maybe because there are still vestiges of it going on within our own, we might say, life world? Or is it that we've already seen this complex play itself out before in an earlier stage? Or could it be both? That's something worth lingering over, and I'm not going to actually answer that at this point. So he's talking about the believing consciousness, and faith itself is not just the person who is believing, or the person who has faith, who's exercising faith, we might say, because faith, belief, both the same word, glauben, right? And it's related to a world. It's related to an object, but that object is a complex object. It's taking in a whole range of things. Now, where is it getting that from? This is where Hegel is saying something quite interesting. Let's see what he says first, and then we'll talk about how we might interpret this. So he says, according to the notion of faith, the Begriff, right? It is nothing but the actual world raised into the universality of pure consciousness. So we have this actual world, and what is the actual world? Not just an actual world of objects, but an actual world of human culture, which we have just seen is full of all these, contradictions and ways in which, even the very perspective on that culture is alienating. And this is being raised to a universal. So does that mean that we're universalizing discordance? No, somehow in the world of faith, we wind up with something that's a harmony. We wind up with some sort of integration. How is that possible from a world of culture that we're transcending, that we're moving beyond? Hegel says that We raise this actual world into the universality of pure consciousness. Remember, pure consciousness, he brings this up over and over again. Pure consciousness is the I which has this capacity of synthesizing, of bringing things together, of integrating them in some way, or at least making it seem like that's happening, because usually in the dialectic, it never turns out that anything is perfectly integrated. So he says that this articulation of this world constitutes the organization of the world of faith. There's a vital difference here, though. He says, in the world of faith, the parts do not alienate themselves in their spiritualization, but are beings, each with an existence of their own, spirits which have returned into themselves and abide with themselves. So there's something like a community going on here. And we'll speculate about what he might have in mind in just a moment. But let that sink in. Here in the actual world of culture, there is discordance. As we raise it to universality, we are drawing upon the actual world, but we're somehow transforming what we're idealizing, you might say, what we're abstracting, into things that can hold our attention and present themselves as having more being than even the actual world. So he tells us the movement of their transition into one another, the movement of the transition of what was, discordant beings here into these spirits that are not discordant with themselves or with each other, he says, is therefore only for us an alienation of the specific character in which they exist in their distinctiveness. Where do they exist in their distinctiveness? Well, really in both of these worlds. The world of the actual culture in which we live, in which we have our individuality, and the world of faith, which has been revealed as a world of pure thought. So he says, this movement is for us a necessary series. But for faith, their difference is a tranquil diversity, and their movement, here's something really interesting, a real happening, a geschehen. Things are actually occurring. Now, what might Hegel have in mind here? Perhaps we might think in terms of the, Christian notion of the community of the saints, individualities who can be connected together, can all be on the same page in what the medievals called a, concordia, right? A concord, a harmony with each other. I don't know that we necessarily need to think about this in terms of Christianity. We might think about this in terms of other faiths where there's something from the actual world and it is transformed into, you might say, a pantheon that actually works. Now, historically, of course, Hegel does have in mind Christianity, but he doesn't have in mind the kind of Christianity, I suppose, that he wants to leave behind through the Reformation. Or does he? Could this be a preliminary stage along the way? So the interpretation is not yet settled, and we need to look ahead to see where pure insight now is going to get involved. But it's very important to notice this transition to a world, not just an object of faith, but a world of faith. To name them briefly according to the external determination of their form, just as in the world of culture, state power or the good was primary, so here too, the first is the absolute being, spirit that is in and for itself insofar as it is the simple, eternal substance. But in the actualization of its notion, in being spirit, it passes over into being for another. Its self-identity becomes an actual, self-sacrificing, absolute being. It becomes a self, but a mortal, perishable self. Consequently, the third moment is the return of this alienated self and of the humiliated substance into their original simplicity. Only in this way is substance represented as spirit. Now in paragraph 532, Hegel is continuing his analysis of faith or Glauben. He has just made this important transition or contrast between the actual world of culture, which is finding a correlate in the world of faith. The actual world of culture, of course, there's kind of disruption going on and contradiction. But over here we have this, at least at first, what appears to be this, harmonious world of faith. But now Hegel is going to describe a transition that's happening, a dialectic within the world of faith in terms of the beings, or perhaps the being itself of these spirits. And Hegel tells us at first that this is similar to what was happening in the dialectic of wealth and state power. And he doesn't fully spell this out, but we might want to remind ourselves. So he says we begin with the good or state power, and you remember that noble consciousness had to figure out, well, where does it fit in with this? And eventually that led us to the point where we moved away from the good being state power, and we looked at wealth, which was this self-sacrificing thing that actually wasn't completely sacrificing itself, and it undid much of what had been gained in the process about the noble consciousness and its service to state power. And now the noble consciousness became dependent upon the self-giving wealth, right? Meaning the wealthy person. So Hegel's saying something similar is happening here in the world of faith between these three moments. He says, to name them, what is them? These spirits, briefly according to the external determination of their form, he says, in the actualization of its notion, in being spirit, in the actualization, the being made actual of the concept in being spirit, it's going to go into a dynamism, right? He says, the first is absolute being. Spirit that is in and for itself insofar as it is the simple, eternal substance. So this is what the consciousness of faith is at first relating itself to. And it finds there a kind of satisfaction. All right, I found God. I found the gods. I found spirit. I found something that is an eternal substance, something I've been looking for, a place to put my heart, a place to invest my desires with. And it's even better, it's really substance. It's not just a figment of my imagination. It's something that's out there that I can have faith in. That gives way, however, as Hegel says, to an actual self-sacrificing being. And I think what we want to see in here is a reference to, if not just Christianity, certainly something where we have historical determinacy, identification of some individual as the God or the divine or the locus where these things are happening. And this element of self-sacrificing is absolutely essential there. It cannot be a God who shows up and is just a human being writ large and says, aha, worship me. I'm super powerful. I will give you whatever. No, there has to be an element of sacrificing its own being. So he says, it becomes a self by doing so. It's no longer merely a substance. Substance is pretty good, but substance without self isn't quite so good, is it? He says it becomes a self, but a mortal, perishable self. A self that we ourselves can, in some sense, identify with, can learn from, can see ourselves in. Then, in the Hegelian three-step, right, he says, consequently, the third moment is the return of this alienated self and of the humiliated substance, so the first two stages, into their original simplicity. And he says, only in this way is substance represented as spirit. So if we were just focusing on the absolute being, on the eternal substance, we're not really grasping the eternal substance as spirit then. That's kind of a problem for the Hegelian. It has to pass through this other stage where it becomes personified, and not just personified as an abstract principle, as something like, God on earth doing everything that God would possibly do, but a being that can be self-sacrificing because it shows itself as vulnerable. This, Hegel thinks, is what is going on within the world of faith. And this exploration of what this spirit, or spirits in the plural, are that the believing consciousness relates itself to in its pure consciousness, in its mode of thinking. These distinct beings, when brought back to themselves by thought out of the flux of the actual world, are immutable eternal spirits, whose being lies in thinking the unity which they constitute. Removed thus from self-consciousness, these beings are nevertheless actively present in it. For if the absolute being were to remain unmoved in the form of the first simple substance, it would remain alien to self-consciousness. But the externalization of this substance, and then its spirit, involves the moment of actuality and thereby makes itself a participant in the self-consciousness of the believer, or the believing consciousness belongs to the actual world. Paragraph 533 is very short, and on its own, I think, would almost be unintelligible. So what we want to do is keep in mind what has just happened in the previous several paragraphs. When he's talking about these distinct beings, when we just had in the previous paragraph a distinct being, we must now think this plurality of multiple beings. We're talking again about the world of faith, right? Where we have these different spirits that are all related to each other. As Hegel says, they are in a kind of unity. So he says, these distinct beings, when brought back to themselves by thought, out of the flux of the actual world, that's referring to what happened in just, the paragraphs before, where the world of faith is really, you might say, a projection or a transfiguration of the world of culture that the person exists within and is trying to get past. So he says, when they're brought out of this flux of the actual world, they become immutable eternal spirits. And we just saw a discussion of this spirit as substance. And then he says, their being lies in thinking the unity which they constitute. So whether we're talking about a pantheon or whether we're talking about the Trinity or whatever we conceive the divine as, a community of the enlightened, something is going on here where the believer who's not in that community as such can relate themselves to something that has come out of the actual world of culture and now exists in a kind of, you might say, pure, pristine, harmonious state. That's not all there is to the story, though. So Hegel's going to go on and he says, removed thus from self-consciousness. When those beings are sublimated like that, they are being removed from self-consciousness. We can attribute a thinking on their part, but we don't really know what it is like for God to think, it's unity with itself or thought thinking itself of Aristotle. We have to find ways to connect that back to us. So he says, these beings are nevertheless actively present in self-consciousness. Why? Because they're an object for the believing self-consciousness. So he goes on and he says, if the absolute being were to remain unmoved in the form of the first simple substance, it would remain alien to self-consciousness. We need an advance here. We need these beings somehow to not be alien to self-consciousness so that self-consciousness isn't just left on its own, kind of looking at them from a distance and wondering, how do I ever get there? We've already done that in the unhappy consciousness, right? So he goes on and he says, the externalization of this substance and then its spirit involves the moment of actuality, thereby makes itself a participant in the self-consciousness of the believer, or the believing consciousness belongs to the actual world. Why is Hegel making an identification there, saying that these really amount to the same thing? The relation of these becoming actual within the self-consciousness of the believer, or the believer being part, or resuming their part, in the actual world. Well, we might think of this as a connection between these, right, and this, but it's actually a reconnection with the actual world of spirit, with self-consciousness being the important juncture point between them.